the third video for the week 2 class session, I'm going to cover the last analytical reading rule, which is rule 5. That rule states, find the important words and through them come to terms with the author. Basically, this means understand the terminology your author is using. Adler and Van Doren point out that words can be unclear in their meanings, mainly because they can have multiple definitions, okay? And they give another term for definitions. They use the word term. So a word can be unclear, but a term has a very specific meaning that the author is using. So let's take the word gay as an example. So gay, most commonly nowadays, refers to a homosexual. However, in Adler and Van Doren's time, the word gay probably more likely meant lighthearted and carefree. So to determine how is this author or a author using this word gay, you're going to have to look at the context of how they're using it. And probably from context it'd be really clear if the author means a homosexual or if they mean lighthearted and carefree. All right, so what we would say is the word gay, Adler and Van Doren would say this, right? The word gay, it's unclear, but this definition, either of homosexual, lighthearted, carefree, is the term. It's the specific meaning of how the author is using it. So when we say come to terms with the author, do you understand the terms the author is using? Okay. How this becomes important in reading is because writers will often use a lot of what we could call abstract words. These can be words like love, justice, neighbor, and you have to understand how is the author defining these words, all right? We all have slightly different ways of defining love or justice, okay? So you can see an example of this in the article you're going to read this week by Allison with the term Good Samaritan. The lawyer in this story from Jesus wants to know how to define the word neighbor, and Jesus then gives him a definition. He basically gives the term for the word neighbor. Okay, so when reading, we have to realize that sometimes we need to step beyond the language to the thought that lies behind it and realize that words in of themselves can be vague and unclear, and we need the context around the words to understand what an author is really meaning. So how do you spot terms when reading? Basically, look for topographical changes like italics or bold or underlines. So these are things that you commonly see in textbooks. They're not always going to appear in articles or other books for us. So if that's the case, look for words unfamiliar to you, maybe like terminology. So think about if you're, reading a music textbook. There's a lot of musical terms in there that we don't use in everyday life. Okay. You can also look for a word that's used in a way that's unfamiliar to you. That's a good clue right there that this author is maybe using this word in a specific way. Last, you can look for words the author gives you a definition of. That's always very helpful when they do that. They may also give you these definitions by illustrating through examples. Okay, so if an author pauses to then give you an example of what they mean, chances are they're using a term there that they want you to pick up on. Lastly, if they look for words where the author kind of creates a word to convey an idea. So like the word climategate kind of comes from, the climate, and then Watergate, kind of a scandal. So you put them together and you have climategate. All right, lastly, finding the meaning of these terms. All right, once you've identified one, how do you figure out what it means? Sometimes you can just look it up with the dictionary or on the internet, find out what alternative meanings that word may have, especially if you're reading a very technical work where there might be a lot of jargon related to that field, like in music or science, nursing, things like that. But most of the time, you're just going to read for context. So this goes back to what we said last week with inspectional reading. You don't want to just labor over a sentence and read it over and over again. Move on, and you'll likely figure out what the word it means from context surrounding that idea. Okay? So as Adler and Van Doren say, you have to discover the meaning of a word you do not understand by using the meanings of all the other words in the context that you do understand. So I want us to practice identifying terms and figuring out what they mean from Adler and Van Doren. So from any of the readings you've done so far, it could be from last week or this week, I want you to provide at least 2 terms that you have encountered while reading, all right? You may provide definitions in your own words for these terms if the authors themselves did not provide a definition, okay? So I want you to complete this in our worksheet. This would be practice rule 5. So go ahead, pause the video, and come back when you're done with that activity. All right, the last activity I want us to do over Adler and Van Duren for this week is to reflect back on the 5 rules of analytical reading that you've learned, and then restate them in your own words. And I want you to do this in the worksheets. This would be this reflect activity that's right down here. All right, so the 5 rules are: you must know what kind of book you're reading. Put that in your own words. How does that make sense to you? State the unity of the whole book in a single sentence or at most a few sentences. Set forth the major parts of the book and show how these are organized into a whole by being ordered to one to the other. Find out what the author's problems were and find the important words and through them come to terms with them. So pause the video, complete this activity, and when you come back, we'll move on to the second book textbook that we'll be using in our course. All right, so our second book is Graff and Birkenstein, and it's called They Say, I Say. Right? Now, before I tell you anything about this book, I want to see what you can discover on your own. So last week we learned about inspectional reading. I want you to do an inspectional reading of this textbook. Okay, for your homework this week, you're assigned chapters 1, 2, 3, and 14. Before you panic, they are all very short chapters because this is a very short and small book. Okay, so it won't be a lot of reading time. But what I want you to do is do an inspectional reading. That means maybe looking at the title, table of contents, blurbs, kind of see what you can discover about the big idea of the book. Maybe ask what type of book this is and how it's structured. And then mark up or annotate anything that you read, maybe like the introductions or conclusions. All right, so pause this video and then complete the relevant section in your worksheet, which you'll find right here under the Graff and Birkenstein lecture with practice. All right, so once you've gone through and done your inspectional reading, the main takeaway I want you to get from this book for this week is that quotes and summaries need context. All right, so context means the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. All right, so what this means and what this They Say, I Say book is trying to tell you is that you can't just plop down an idea from a source in your paper and expect that the reader is going to fully understand that idea that you inserted. You always have to explain and give some background of what was the author saying before they gave that quote, why were they saying this quote, and what does this quote mean for what you are saying in your paper. So if I ever say give background information, give context, I'm saying explain to your reader why are you putting this quote in and what was this author saying before you copied and pasted this quote into your paper, okay? So basically we want to use what's called the sandwich method, all right? Introduce your quote or summary. Who is saying this? Where was it being said? Why did the person say it? What's the main idea behind this statement? Then you give your quote or summary from your source. Then lastly, explain the quote and summary or analyze it. So what should the reader notice about what the author is saying? And how does what the author said relate to what you're saying? Okay. Now to illustrate this point, I have a fun activity for you to do. I wish we could all do this live together, but I want you to basically explain what is the relationship between these 3 pictures. We have some Quaker Oats chewy granola bars, we have a candle, and we have hand sanitizer. All right, so in your worksheet, I've put these images in for you, and in 1 or 2 sentences, explain the relationship you see between these 3 items. And that can be, however, I get a lot of creative responses with this. And what I will do in the week after you turn in these worksheets, I'm going to share your responses with the class, and we're going to see all the different ways that this simple activity, how you guys can respond to it, and I'll explain the point of this activity a little bit more at that time. So pause the video and complete this exercise, and then go on to our last and final video when you're done.